myself. And, oh, yeah, we'll do that first.
You're good now. Go ahead.
Great. So I just want to take a minute to introduce myself and kind of give you a little bit of the backstory of how I got into this field of digital accessibility, because it's not something that I think a lot of people are particularly familiar with, although it is really growing as an industry, and we'll talk about why that is happening to some degree too. So my name is Kimberly Norris, and I run the digital accessibility office at Carnegie Mellon University. And I have been doing website development and user experience design and digital accessibility for 15 or 20 years now. And how I sort of got into this was that back when I started website development, as I think some of my colleagues did, our websites were very much like the paper equivalent of information. So we took the standard layout of sort of a portrait piece of paper and we put it on the web. And so everything scrolled up and down. There wasn't a lot of side swiping. Everything was on computers because there weren't smartphones or mobile devices yet. I know I'm really dating myself with that. But the very first time that I ever had to build a website for a mobile device, I had to do it as a completely separate set of code. So we started with a full computer website, and then we would do a completely separate mobile version of the same content. And it was the most awful process I have ever gone through in my life. And then whenever you went to update something, you had to change everything in two places because you had two completely separate sets of code. And then it started to get even worse as tablets came out, and you could turn your devices different directions, and the information just did not translate well across multiple devices. And so I looked at this at the beginning and I thought, there has to be a better way to do this. We have got to be able to create code that can be more fluid than this. We've got to be able to come up with content that can fit into multiple containers. And of course, that was the birth of responsive design. And earlier tonight, there was a presentation and someone talked about design being age responsive in the future. So this idea that depending on how old you are, or maybe some of the other preferences that you have, possibly gender or some of the disabilities that you may have, that websites should be able to adapt to you. So as we start thinking about design, it's not just about the range of devices, but also the range of users that we have. And I believe that we can create content, design content that can serve multiple purposes and still be extremely efficient in the fact that you should be able to update it in one place, that you should be able to maintain your content in a single kind of space and have it work for everyone. So that's what we are going to be talking about this evening. Let me go ahead and share these slides. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So again, this is me. I'm Kimberly Norris. I will leave my email address for you all. If anyone would like to contact me, you're always welcome to reach out. And that goes for Kent's class as well. It'd be great to hear from those of you at WVU. So what is digital accessibility? Well, it's the practice of being inclusive. So making sure that there are no barriers, or if there are barriers, finding workarounds to get around those barriers so that everyone can interact with and access websites regardless of their physical disabilities, their situational disabilities, or their socioeconomic restrictions. So that's the general idea. So why do we do this? Well, part of this is that the world is moving towards greater personalization and user-centered design. So this is some of the human function that Kent was talking about as well, where we are talking about personalizing the internet for everyone. So making sure that it is the best fit for you as an individual. 26%, that's an estimate of the United States, adults in the United States have disabilities, and the majority of disabilities are invisible, and they are, I think the statistic is about 70% of individuals with disabilities do not disclose them in most situations. So if you are going to give a presentation or create a website, odds are good that someone in your audience will have a disability of some kind, and you probably will not know that that person has a disability. So part of what we're doing with these kinds of best practices is to make sure that people are not required to disclose their disabilities. The internet should work for everyone regardless, and we shouldn't have to make specific accommodations due to a disability. We also do this because technology changes. There are always going to be new devices and new ways of exploring the internet, and we want to be able to keep pace with those changing devices. And the third reason why we do accessibility is that it is the law. And so I mentioned earlier that this is a growing field, and a large part of the reason why it's a growing field is because people are getting sued over this every day. So the Americans with Disabilities Act states that regardless of disability, people need to equal access to information. And the internet is now a part of that. So I think we are going to see a change to the ADA and to the Rehabilitation Act in the next year that will help to really solidify exactly what that means. Right now, the law is pretty broad and it just says equal access, which can be interpreted a lot of different ways. But we wanted to make sure that everyone has equal access to information. The internet is a great equalizer, and it really levels the playing field for people who come from disadvantaged situations. So this is something that is very important, and the law upholds this over and over again, that that if you have a website that is not accessible, it needs to be corrected. So we're going to break tonight up into 4 different user groups. These are different types of disabilities, and some of the things that we can think about to support users in each of these categories. It's important to note when we think about this that some users will have multiple disabilities. So it's important to do all of these things as a both and. This is not an either or kind of category. You'll find that a lot of accessibility is about redundancy. It's about doing things multiple ways so that everything can be accessed by some individuals. So we will do auditory users first. So users with auditory disabilities could be, of course, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but these are not the only kinds of users that don't have audio. If you think about being on a crowded subway and forgetting your headphones, that might be a situation where you don't want to have audio. Same with if you're laying in bed and you've got a partner sleeping next to you and you don't want to wake up your sleeping partner, that's a good reason to keep your volume low or your audio off. And when we think about closed captioning, which if you could even do a show of hands, I don't know how many of you prefer to have closed captioning on when you watch television. If it's a younger audience, the closed captioning tends to be favored about 70%. So the majority of people under 40 prefer to have closed captioning on all the time when they are watching television. But in particular, for things like bars and restaurants where it's noisy, if you want to keep up with what's going on in the game or follow the captions on the news, you have to have that information written on the screen. So those are all scenarios where maybe the closed captioning could really be helpful. So what do we do to support users with hearing disabilities? So the first one I already mentioned is closed captioning for videos, which I think many of you are probably already familiar with. Slightly less familiar, but really the same kind of technology is this idea of transcribing your audio files. So if you have a podcast or any kind of an audio file, you want to make sure that there is a written description that accompanies the audio file. The only real difference between captions and audio and transcriptions is that captions have timing. So captions occur at the same time as the pictures are moving or your slides are moving, those kinds of things. Whereas a transcript is just a solid block of text. It does not necessarily have timing with it. If you have multimedia, so anything that is visual and auditory, then you're required to have the timing, so you'll need captions. The other things that we want to think about are that a number of these users will use American Sign Language. So as you are designing your slides or spaces, you want to think about leaving room in certain places for the ASL interpreter or for on-screen captions. So for the most part, this happens down here at the bottoms of the slides. Usually the captions would go here, and then the interpreter would go in the bottom right corner. So any questions about auditory before we move on to visual? I'll just keep buzzing along, but just yell if there's something. Okay, so users with low or no vision. So we of course think of people who are blind, but this can also be users who are colorblind, which is a significant portion of the population. About 8% of men are colorblind. So it's close to 4.5% of the total population. It's not something that comes up a lot, but it's actually a very common disability. You can also think about people who are driving. So if a lot of you are students, a number of students I know that I work with really prefer to listen to their textbooks when they are driving because they don't always have time to sit and read. So being able to translate text into audio has good purposes for using in the car or other places where you may not be able to visually take your eyes away from something. This also works well for people who are just busy and multitasking. So as I was listening to some of the previous presentations, I was washing my dishes and doing all of my other things at home because this is the way that we work now, right? Most of us multitask and listen to webinars and do the whole thing all at the same time. And so you can't assume anymore that your audience necessarily has their eyes on your screen the entire time that you're talking. So it's important to describe visual elements that are occurring on your screen, even if you can't see them. So what we use to support these kinds of users are what we call alternative text equivalents. So basically, every time you insert a picture or a graph or a chart or any kind of anything that is visual, you want to make sure that you are describing that image in text. And we do this with hidden fields. Usually, if you're using like a content management system or something like PowerPoint, there will always be a field somewhere where you can insert content that describes the image. And we want to keep these image descriptions short. My rule is usually like 10 words or less, unless it's really a complicated graphic that you really want people to have a more in-depth understanding of. We can also use a heading outline structure. So you want to make sure that more important elements get lower numbers of headings. So you start with a heading 1, use your heading 2s. That helps to keep your page organized. And that helps people who are listening to your content to be able to follow along and find the elements that they need. Okay, so most people who are blind access the internet through what we call a screen reader. So they have an assistive technology that reads the content aloud for them. And you can try this at home. There is a free one called NVDA that works on Windows, or VoiceOver comes already installed on a Mac. You just have to turn it on. I'm going to give you an example of one. This is a slide that was made in PowerPoint, and all I did was just drop this content in here. I did not think about accessibility in any way. I did not format this slide. I just dropped elements in here the way that anyone would. And I'm going to play for you what it sounds like if you were just listening to it and not able to see it. So listen along. Sorry. Maybe you are not going to be able to hear that. Give me 1 second.
There's a little option to share sound.
Yeah, I don't think that's my issue. I think the video somehow came
Okay.
disconnected, but let me just see if I have it here. This is why I always test these things ahead of time, you know. Let's see.
It's Zoom. Even if you did, it still might break. So
Yeah, fair point. Let me see. Okay. Tell you what, I think I have it. I think I have it in PowerPoint here. Let me just stop sharing for a second. Okay. Let's see if you can hear it here.
Slideshow slide 1. Slide 1. The red maple picture 01137.jpg Acer rubrum picture. A close-up of a red leaf description automatically generated with low confidence. Deciduous tree found in North America at maturity is often 100 feet tall. Leaves are typically 31 divided by 2 to 41 divided by 4 in long. Provides medium to high quality lumber. Fun facts: graphic acorn solid, graphic acorn solid, graphic acorn solid, graphic acorn solid.
So if you could hear that, that's pretty miserable. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger so you can see it. But basically that's what happened is it read the file names of the images and like all of these acorns that are sort of in here in the place of bullets. It understands those as graphics, but it can't associate those with the text. So it just listed them all at the end, some of those kinds of things. So this same slide, if we were to remake it and think a little bit about the reading order, to use real bullets instead of using graphics, to give our images logical alt text that makes sense, and to just clean up the text a little bit so that it's a little bit clearer, it would sound more like this.
Frame, slideshow slide 2, the red maple Acer rubrum. The red maple Acer rubrum. Fun facts: bullet deciduous tree found in North America. Bullet at maturity is often 100 feet tall. Bullet leaves are typically 3½ to 4¼ inches long. Bullet provides medium to high quality lumber. Picture a close-up of a red maple leaf in red fall color. The leaf shape is jagged and has 3 shallow lobes. Picture red maple tree with pyramid-shaped foliage at the top and a single bare trunk at the bottom.
Right, so a lot better, right? Let me switch back over. So just by thinking about our content, oops, sorry, wrong one. Just by thinking about our content in a logical manner and making sure that we are conscientious of using the built-in tools. So you want to make sure that you use real headings, real bullets, things that are provided for you in the software. And if you're thinking about this from a web development standpoint, then you want to do it in the HTML markup. You want to make sure that buttons are labeled as buttons, that that everything has clear markup, and that lists are actual lists so that the screen reader can pick up that information. One other thing to think about with screen readers is that the way that blind people interact with the internet is very similar to the way that artificial intelligence interacts with the internet as well. So this is all about being able to get text content and to be able to create algorithms around that text content so that it is more searchable and more usable by machinery. So, so anything that you do really to support users who do not have sight will also give you support in things like search engines. In addition to things that we can do for people who have low vision are to make sure that any call to action areas that you have are large. And this is helpful for people, again, who are driving and using their phones, which you should not be doing, but you want to make sure that the buttons are big enough that people can actually hit the right thing and not be touching other parts of the screen that they don't want to be interacting with. And finally, we want to think about color contrast. So you want to make sure that your text color is readable for everyone. And the best example of why you should do this for me came from, there's a guy named Adrian Roselli who gave a talk a long time ago called Selfish Accessibility. And he said that he had a difficult time convincing his clients that they needed to raise the contrast of their text because of people with low vision or color blindness. That was not something that he could sell them on. But what he could sell them on was the idea that when they were out on the golf course and they were looking at their phones in the bright sunlight and they had to keep cranking the brightness up on their phones, that they wanted those golfers to be able to read those websites. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, is that situationally, text changes. And so you want to make sure that those color contrast ratios are high, or you want to give people the ability to customize. So we talked about customization early on. Your alternative, if it's not a fixed thing that has to stay in a certain set of colors, is to give people a night vision mode, or to allow them to choose their own colors of text and background, or use a focus mode if they want to. So just make sure that you're designing in such a way that people can customize if the color combinations that you want to use are not within this 4.5:1 contrast ratio. Okay, so here are some color contrasts that may or may not meet the color contrast ratio. So I will just let you look for a minute and think about which of these color combinations you think would pass or fail. And I'll just say, as you're looking and thinking, that every one of these combinations came from a Carnegie Mellon website. So these are actually combinations that are out there that people are using. And these are all close. So this is specifically a hard exam. Okay, you got your answers in your head. There you go. So 2, 5, and 6 pass, 1, 3, and 4 fail. And I only do this as an example to show you that you often really can't tell just by looking at it. Many of you, particularly those of you who are graphic designers or have spent a lot of time in marketing, probably are better at this than average, but most people fail this test because this is a mathematical equation. It isn't about what it looks like to you. This is about the way that the colors are understood on computer screens. So you actually have to run this through a color contrast checker. You can't just go with your gut instinct on this. Okay, so finally, support for users who cannot see. We want to make sure that we are not using color as the only means of conveying information. And this rule comes along mostly when we talk about things like data visualization. So, for example, if you have a very simple line chart with just 2 lines, and one line is representing yuks and one line is representing zooks, and you have a red line and a green line, for people who are red or green colorblind, which is the most common form of color blindness, this chart will probably look something like the chart on the right. And there's actually, like I said, it's a fairly common issue to have color blindness. So for some of you, actually, both of these charts possibly look the same, right? And so this can be extremely confusing. There's no way to differentiate this information, and we want to not rely on color in that way. So this passes. The idea here is that you can use shape or haptics or any number of different things to differentiate other than just color. So what I always recommend is, if you're not sure, put it into a colorblind simulator and take a look at it and make sure that the information is understandable without color. Okay, any questions about visual disabilities or things we can do to support those? We'll move on to motor. So whenever we think about people with limited motor skills, this could be people who are in wheelchairs and have limited use of their extremities or different things like that. Or it could be people who are using unusual equipment like headsets or any of the voice activated things now. So, right, I just tell my thermostat to change the temperature. I don't have to get up and do that anymore. These voice activated devices are becoming much more popular, as are gaming systems, which can be interacted with in a number of ways. Joysticks are useful for people with limited motor skills, and they're also common amongst gamers. And sometimes people have very specific equipment that is designed just for them in terms of keyboards. We can think about people who are transcriptionists that have unusual setups, and sometimes those setups also support disabilities. So most users who do not have a mouse, we consider them keyboard only users. And so almost all of the technology in this space is built around a regular keyboard API kind of connection. So if you can do it from a regular standard keyboard, if everything is usable from a keyboard without a mouse, we usually consider that passing. That is kind of the standard. So what we want to think about is when you first go to a website, you should be able to just use your tab key and your arrow keys, and you should be able to move all through your website without ever having to touch your mouse. That's what we're trying to get to. And as you are doing that, you need to think about focus states. So as you're moving through your website, what's changing? Where is the indicator that is telling you what you're interacting with? So if nothing is changing, then it's, even if the element is interactable, like you wouldn't necessarily know where you are on the page. So it's important to think about that keyboard interaction in a visual sense. We talked a little bit about the outline format before, that you can use headings 1, 2, 3 to organize your page. That's especially useful for this as well, because most users who use a keyboard only will, they use a lot of keyboard shortcuts. And so things like headings help them to jump and to skip content that isn't necessary for them. Search is extremely helpful for keyboard only users. If they can search or filter content, that reduces time scrolling and scrolling. And finally, we want to make sure that we're using large click areas so that you're able to interact with those elements. Even if users are using a mouse, you want to make sure that they can target those appropriately. Okay, and our final, actually, before I go on to cognitive, I want to say one thing that's kind of encompassing from those first 3 categories, which is that I by no means want to limit your creativity with this. When we start talking about accessibility, a lot of times people say to me, well, that's a lot of rules, like don't do this, don't do that. And that is not at all the way that we really want this to be. I would never want this to be a limiting process for you. And when we think about some of those websites, we were watching a presentation earlier that had this really interactive ocean website where you went in and you could see and hear and move around in the ocean and learn about all of these different elements. And those are very cool websites, and it's wonderful to have that level of user experience and interaction. But what we also want to do as we're thinking about it is just think through, if I did not have sight, what would this experience be like? If I did not have hearing, what would this experience be like? If I could not use a mouse, what would this experience be like? And if we think through those things as we're moving along, then our content will work better on multiple devices. It will work better for a wider variety of audiences, and it'll just be more usable in general. So don't limit your creativity, but do a both and. Add these things to whatever content you have. Okay, so our cognitive category winds up being largely everyone else who has a disability, or just other kinds of users that we haven't necessarily talked about and considered. As people age, they come into this category more, and that's not necessarily because they actually develop cognitive disabilities as they age, although sometimes that can happen, but sometimes it's just because that's where the non-native technology users are. And sometimes it is because The newer technologies are just adapted more to a younger generation. So as people age, they sometimes fall into this category. Again, sometimes people are just busy and they're multitasking, and that is a lot of strain on the cognitive functions. So we can't always assume that we have people's full attention. And there are also a variety of cognitive disabilities that could include any of the neurotypical disabilities. These can also include things like migraines and seizures, people with epilepsy. So there are some things that we want to keep in mind for these users as well. So navigation is a big one for usability. You want to think about how users are going to get around in your space. And when it comes to navigation, this is one where maybe I would limit the creativity a little bit. Sometimes a regular drop-down menu with really good choices is your best bet. So you could do some really creative things with it, but I would be careful with navigation. You want to make sure that it's clear how to get around your site. You also want to make sure that the most important information on the page gets put up first. You want to think a little bit about passwords and captchas and how you are taking information. This is a big one at CMU because we are so big on information security and cybersecurity. And so we really want to have secure systems. But sometimes security and accessibility can be a little bit at odds. We want to make sure that even if we have a secure system, that everyone is able to use it. And so sometimes when things require really complicated captchas, that can be a real problem for users with disabilities. So what I recommend is always having a redundant workaround. So if one system isn't necessarily going to work for every kind of user, you should be able to give them multiple options of access. For timeout warnings are important. If you're designing something like, let's say, a banking website, you want to be able to log people out for security purposes, but there are rules that you should warn them before you just throw them out of whatever it is that they're doing, particularly if they're filling out a form or something that is not going to be saved. You need to allow them the option to get extended time. Be conscientious of distractions and changes. So if you want to use animations on your website, that's okay, but be careful that you don't have anything that pops up or flashes that would startle someone. And you also want to think about rapid changes in light and dark patterns. So if even with the slides, like if you're giving a slide presentation, you don't want to do a really light background followed by a really dark background followed by a really light background, because what happens is if you have to scroll through your slides rapidly, you'll create a strobe light effect and you could accidentally give someone a seizure or a migraine. So think about distractions and changes. You want things to move slowly and you don't want to do a lot of flashing lights. And then finally, in support of cognitive users, we want to think about our reading levels a little bit. So the statistic currently is that most high school graduates in the United States read at about an 8th grade level. And as a result, we have to be careful about what it is that we do. And I think we have to think about our audience. So if you are writing content for a broad audience, then you probably want to keep the reading level relatively low. You want to use fairly simple words, or if you have a lot of complex jargon for whatever it is that you're doing, you want to make sure that you explain those things thoroughly. And you also may want to give people audio help. So if you have some unusual words that they may not recognize in written form, then you can allow them to listen to those words and hear the proper pronunciation. So a lot of this content that I gave you comes from the WCAG standard. You'll hear it WCAG sometimes. It is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it comes from the W3C. So if you want to learn more information about these standards and about what we promote, you can get that on the website. There is also a link here for a Wave tool that is used for testing websites. So if you have web content and you are curious if your web content meets accessibility standards, you can use that. And there's some videos that are provided at Section 508, which is that's part of the law. This is the government resource website to help you meet the government regulations if you are interested in learning to technically meet the standards that the government requires for these things. Thank you so much. Are there any questions?
That's awesome, Kim. Thank you so much. I always learn a ton about accessibility when you do this presentation. And, you know, I also feel like accessibility is something that all designers and marketers have to continually refresh their memory on.
It's easy to forget about, I think,
Yeah.
and it's also easy to get overwhelmed because there's a lot of things to consider. But yeah, it's an important field, and I've had, you know, hundreds of people probably over the course of my career tell me how much it matters, you know, what a difference it makes whenever something is accessible to them that otherwise wouldn't have been. So.
Nadia, Valerie, anyone from Kent's class? Questions?
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, thank you, Kim. This was wonderful. And, you know, you're the last presentation of the last session of the design track. And I think you might have closed this out last time. So that's intentional because I want to end on a high note. So yeah, so thank you again. This was wonderful. And we'll be getting the YouTube video packaged up and sent out this week, and you'll see an email about that. So thank you all for attending, and thank you, Kent and Scott and Nadia I'm sorry, not Nadia, Kim. Thank Nadia too. She's been in every single one. Valerie. Thank you all for being here and contributing. It's been hopefully it's been a great experience for you all. So have a wonderful night, and we'll talk soon.